You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. So before I get into this week's show, I just wanted to talk a little bit about something that I struggle with that I probably don't talk about enough: health anxiety. It's something that I am sure we all deal with to a certain extent, but it can be really paralyzing. And as anyone knows who listened to my show on breast health and mammograms knows that I 100% wrangle with. And since I do a show that is pretty consistently telling people to work with doctors, I felt I should say loud and clearly that seeing doctors, getting evaluations, and just engaging with the medical system is something that is hard for me. I also have plenty of performance anxiety, which intermingles with health anxiety in interesting ways because I, as maybe many of you, hang a lot of my identity on being fit and healthy. And not being one or both of those things definitely shakes me at a foundational level. And I have been working recently really hard to get past that, to look at both my health and my fitness more objectively as things that don't necessarily define me, but aspects of myself that are ever changing and always have room for improvement. So, as such, I'll tell you that I put on my big girl pants last week and I made a visit to Eternal headquarters in New York City. And if you don't know what Eternal is, it's a new high performance healthcare program for athletes. So you work with athlete informed doctors and dietitians, as well as health informed coaches, Stacy Sims, Carla DiGirolamo, Lauren Fleischman. A lot of folks I've worked with and respect are involved. And I was invited to try it out. And I'll tell you, it is really comprehensive. There was very detailed blood work. I had like 11 vials drawn, a DEXA scan, body comp, a whole battery of power, balance, mobility, stability, and performance tests, including lactate threshold and VO2 max, which I did on a treadmill for the very first time instead of a bike, and that was an experience. And I just kept telling myself the results don't change reality. Whatever happens there doesn't change what I am inside. They help you shape your reality. And that's kind of become my mantra going into the future. And I'll share more of my journey here and there as I go through all this, but I just wanted to share up front in this episode that this stuff is stressful and hard for me too. Okay, speaking of hard, stressful things, that was a perfect segue because this week's show is all about stress. Specifically, how despite everything we hear as midlife and peri and menopausal women about how we need to avoid and lower stress and that cortisol is the enemy of like everything, the truth is we really, really need stress if we want to perform our best and have good health and longevity. And to break that all down, I had a really informative and honestly truly delightful conversation with this week's guest, Dr. Sharon Horesh Bergquist. She's a physician, a researcher, and author of The Stress Paradox: Why You Need Stress to Live Longer, Healthier, and Happier. And we break it all down. We break down the concept of hormesis, which is really just that enough stress plus recovery cycle, how the right doses of stress in the form of training, plant phytochemicals, those vegetables that are apparently trying to kill you, as some of the, online bros will tell you, hot and cold exposure, and yes, smart time restricted eating activates cellular defense pathways that ultimately rebuild us to be stronger right down to our DNA. We also dive into how to stack stressors without tipping us into overload, which is key for active midlife and peri and menopausal women. So breaking that all down, it was really, really a great conversation. Dr. Sharon Bergquist is she's very modest, but boy, she's got a great resume. She is a practicing board certified physician, a researcher, and really a pioneer in lifestyle medicine. She has helped lead clinical trials that have received more than $60 million in funding for evaluating the benefits of lifestyle interventions for things like Alzheimer's and cancer. Her TED video talks about how stress affects your body, and that has garnered over 8 million views and has been translated into 35 languages. She is a gem, and I hope you enjoy this one as much as I did. I will put links to all of her things in the show notes so you can check her out for yourself. Before I get to it, very quickly, give us a follow at Feisty Menopause on Instagram and Facebook. Head into those show notes and sign up for my free weekly Feisty 40 Plus newsletter. And as always, if you like the show, do me a favor, share it with a friend and a colleague. That really helps the show to grow, find new followers, and I super appreciate it. All right, finally, quick thanks to NutriSense for their continued support. I'll be doing another show pretty shortly on blood sugar and midlife, and NutriSense helps you get that all under control. So thanks, NutriSense, for your continued support. All right, enough of me. Let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. All right, Sharon, I am very excited to talk to you today about your book, The Stress Paradox. So welcome to Hit Play Not Pause.
Oh, thank you so much, Celine. I'm so excited to be here.
So let's talk right off the top about hormesis, which is a lot of what you talk about in the book. And even if people listening don't know that word, and I'm suspecting quite a few don't, because it's not really lingo that's in the lexicon of our time yet. I think that many in our audience do understand innately what it is because a lot of us are training. So we train for triathlon or we train in CrossFit, and that is you put a bunch of stress on your body, you let it recover, you get stronger. So there's a little dance between how much stress and how much non-stress. The same thing maybe said at work. I shared with you before we came on to record here that I've always thought about the concept of stress balance. Like in my work, if I don't have a deadline, people think that it's a really great thing, Sharon. Like, oh, get it to me whenever. I'm like, that means never. Ne Whenever is never. If you don't give me a deadline, I don't have any stress in the system and I can't, it's like a guitar string without any tension. There is no music. You need a little tension to make music. If you put too much tension and you tell me it's due tomorrow, the string snaps and that's bad too. So, long way of saying, let's talk hormesis.
Yes, and that's a beautiful way to explain it because that's exactly what hormesis is. I think of it as the science of good stress. We need a mild to moderate amount of stress, followed by recovery, which is equally important as the stress, to become stronger, to build our resilience towards stress. And that's really the key.
Is building resilience to stress.
Right. The goal of stress is not stress for the sake of stressing ourselves out. I mean, nobody needs more stress. We have plenty of it. But this is a certain type of stress at a certain dose and a certain duration that helps us rebuild in a stronger state where we're more resilient. So we typically think of resilience as just bouncing back from stress. What we're doing here with good stress is more than just resilience. We're not just bouncing back, we're building stronger. So it's anti fragility.
I like that too. So in page 27, I believe, of your book, you talk about some of the underpinnings here that give us that resilience, I think, like the cellular stress response. And I'd love to get a little nerdy here a bit and talk about some of that because these are processes a lot of the audience probably doesn't know.
So I love nerdy, so I'm more than
Good.
happy to go there. I mean, my background is in biophysics and biochemistry,
Excellent.
and I've done a lot of research at the level of our cells and molecules. So nerdy is where I live. Uh, and that's really where we understand stress differently because we all know about the stress response, which is our fight or flight response, right? We release cortisol, norepinephrine, and eventually our adrenal glands through the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis release cortisol, which is commonly dubbed as the stress hormone. There's an entirely different layer of stress that is happening at the level of our cells. And to me, that's the untold story of
Mm.
stress. When we have that fight or flight response, it's like stressing fast, right? It's our emergency response. What's happening at the level of our cells is stressing slow. So I think of this as, we stress fast and we stress slow. So what happens at the level of our cells is an adaptation to the stress that can go on for hours and weeks, even years after the exposure to the stressor. And our stress responses at the level of our cells are there to help us. They're there to help us adapt to our environment, to build our stress resilience, essentially to survive and really deal with all of the things that we have, be it modern day pollutants in our ancestors' lives that were different threats to our existence. But our stress response is an adaptation mechanism. And that really plays out at the level of our cells.
So is you talked about the fast and the slow. Is that happening from the same stress event?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The so stress, if we defined it, is anything that challenges our body.
Okay.
And what the stress is doing, whether it's mental, physical, emotional, is it's throwing our body out of a natural balance that we call homeostasis. And we have tremendous feedback mechanisms to reestablish homeostasis because that's the balance we need for health. It's the balance we need for longevity and for survival. So, what we're doing with that stress response then is we're trying to reestablish. So, we always experience stress. Our central nervous system, our brains experience that adrenaline surge, that stress response, but it ripples down to our cells. So we're simultaneously triggering cellular stress responses just as we are triggering a nervous system response. And that is a really key point, Celine, because the stress stimulus is what triggers a lot of the adaptations that are happening in our muscles and really in every part of our cells that help us become stronger. I mean, this is really the key of why our bodies need that stress to make us our healthiest selves.
Before we get into some of those more prescriptive stresses that you talk about in the book, you hear a lot in the typical conversation about stress, about quote unquote good stress and bad stress. And intuitively, I understand that. Living in a war zone seems like really terrible stress.
Yes.
Training for an Ironman feels terrible sometimes, but it's not the same terrible, right? So, is there a distinction there that is important?
Yes, there's a clear distinction there. So, a lot of the stressors that are in our life, like living in a war zone, financial hardship, relational conflict,
Yep.
these are
Losing a
chronic
job.
stressors. Exactly. These are chronic stressors, and our bodies are not adapted to chronic stressors. What we're talking about in terms of good stress are the episodic stressors, where you stress and recover. And that's the type of stress that we benefit from and we grow from.
If I am going through a divorce, a loss of somebody, like having that chronic stress that you're talking about, is there benefit to good stress or not?
There is. So there are several ways we can manage the stress in our life. The
Okay.
common mantra, really the common stress management, are to try and limit our exposure to the stressor to the degree that we can. Obviously, things like financial hardship, sometimes we can't avoid the stressor, but we also try and meditate and find ways to reduce our reactivity to the stressor. This is an
Yes.
entirely different response. We are using good stress to build our resistance, our resilience to the stress.
Mm.
So we're not trying to get rid of the financial hardship. Again, we can't always control the stressor, but this resilience piece, the resilience is the muscle, right? We are training resilience. We have full agency and control over the resilience component. And I think it's so understated how much we can do to tolerate the stress in our lives better by building the resilience.
I love that, and that makes a lot of sense. And while you were talking, a little light bulb went off that I wrote about exactly what you were talking about using exercise. It was for Prevention Magazine in the 90s, I believe, like 1998 or something like that, about how that is one of the benefits of the exercise stress is it makes you more resilient to the other stress that comes into your life. And I feel that deeply in my own life. Having been an ultra endurance athlete, very few things really stress me out because I'm used to just being on a bike for 8 hours a day, day after day after day. So when something sort of, when I'm in traffic or something, I'm just like, okay.
Yes. Oh, exactly. You've really trained that resilience muscle. And then what you experience as a stressor is going to be different than the next person who hasn't built that resilience muscle. And at the level of our cells, there's cross adaptation,
Mm.
meaning that if you use exercise to make your cells healthier, which is what our cellular stress responses do, they increase our energy capability through our mitochondria, make our mitochondria healthier, repair our DNA, repair our proteins, and we can go through that in more detail. But ultimately, our cells become healthier. They function better. They're more capable of making energy and doing their tasks. Whether that cell is in our heart and is improving our cardiac function, or that cell is in our muscle, improving our muscle performance, or in our brain, helping us be more resilient to different mood states, creative thinking, decision making. At the upshot, we're ultimately going upstream as much as possible to the root cause of what controls our health, our longevity, our quality of life, our human potential. And that drills down to the smallest unit in our body, and that's our cells.
So in your book, you outline pillars. What do you call them in the book? You don't call them pillars, but they're different pockets of stress that you recommend. Um, I would love to dig into a few of those specifically. One of the ones off the top that really hit me is plants, because especially in this moment in time when you have some carnivore bros, and they're usually bros, I'm sorry, saying plants are trying to kill us. They have toxins. You shouldn't eat them because you're not supposed to because they're toxic. That's Please talk to that. Like what is the benefit of these plant toxins for our resilience?
Yeah, so there's two parts to this. One is when you go down any pathway of, are plant toxins, anti-nutrients, are they harmful to us? You're really taking one micro piece of a much larger picture of how plants affect us. And I think that's where science interpretation goes awry. I think people go down rabbit holes, and you really have to look at the totality of the net effect of plant chemicals or plant toxins on our health. And there's been a complete 180 in our understanding of that. For 50 years of nutritional science research, we've always thought of phytochemicals, which are plant
Mhm.
chemicals, of giving us antioxidants, right? We need to eat the colors of the rainbow because we need, the blue in the blueberries to get a certain phytochemical and the red in the strawberries to get the flavor in that phytochemical. But the assumption is that we are exogenously getting these antioxidants and that the more food we eat that has these plant phytochemicals, the more antioxidants we're consuming. And the flaw in that theory is that if you measure the amount of antioxidants in our body when we consume a very plant centric diet, it ends up being on the order of nanomolars. When you really trace back the amount of or the concentration of antioxidants we would need to neutralize the oxidative stress in a kind of tit for tat way, it's on the order of micromolars. So there's this delta that has never really been well resolved. And when you understand how plants benefit us from the standpoint of hormesis, it really all comes together because that tiny bit of phytochemical stress our bodies perceive as a toxin that gently stresses our body, and that gentle stress activates cellular stress responses that ramp up our endogenous, our natural antioxidant capability. They ramp up our natural DNA repair capability, protein repair, mitochondrial biogenesis, and making new mitochondria in our body. Autophagy is stimulated by these plant chemicals. And that is such a 180, a revolutionary way of really understanding how we have co evolved with plants and how they are so inextricably blended with our physiology over eons of years of our ancestors surviving to their environment, that we simply cannot be healthy without getting these gentle stress stimuli to help us use our natural defenses against disease and aging.
And this also dovetails with what research has been showing us for a long time. I worked on a book in 1994 for Rodale Press called Healing with Vitamins, and that is when beta carotene, vitamin C, and vitamin E was going to cure everything. If we only took mega doses, and
Yes.
boy, oh boy, were some of those doses that people were recommending at that time quite high. We were going to live forever. We would never, quote unquote, rust, like cellular, like all these things. And then if you remember the beta carotene smoker study, it was a
Yes.
disaster. It was a disaster. They had to stop it, and those men were still getting higher rates of cancer decades down the road. So we had taken this one thing out of a plant and we're like, this is the thing. This is the thing that will keep us from getting cancer and heart disease and on and on. And what you're saying makes sense. Like you can't just pull it out of the plant and take it in mega doses because then you're doing bad, just very simply saying, doing bad things within the system. And the same was true in the early aughts. They were putting antioxidants in some sports nutrition, and they were discovering, oh, that's actually blunting our exercise response. So they weren't really understanding the mechanisms yet. They were just assuming that this is the thing that's doing good things inside of us, so we must take more and put it in everything. And that I always caution people, science often puts the cart before the horse before they understand the directional way
And it
that
leads
things are
to a lot,
working.
right, Celine, and I'm so glad you brought that up because I mean it leads to certain logical fallacies. You know, if a little bit is good, more is better,
There's
which
that.
the science of hormesis, and this is such a recurrent theme that I think we'll end up running into, is that we need that mild to moderate stress to activate the healing responses. It is not, if it doesn't kill us, it will make you stronger. You don't want that severe amount of stress. That becomes a harmful stress, right? There's this Goldilocks amount of stress that is optimal for our body. And that applies to the phytochemicals. It applies to how we stack different stressors, questions that arise related to, should you add stressors like fasting to exercise to phytochemicals? How
Right.
we stack the benefit we get are limited by being in that sweet spot, that Goldilocks zone, to avoid becoming a harmful stressor where we exceed that beneficial zone.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent point. So before we leave the vegetables and the fruits, is five the magic serving that we get from the food pyramid and the plate and all the other things that the government tells us? Or where do you find in the research as far as what what people should think about when they're thinking about their plant consumption?
Yeah, I would really think of two things. So the first, as you pointed out, is simply quantity. Right now, the recommendation is to get five fruits or and vegetables a day. Currently, 1 out of 10 people in America are meeting that. So certainly, we've got a long way to go to meet the quantity. And then the second part, and this is really what I come across in my clinical practice, a lot of people follow a healthy diet, meaning they're doing mostly whole foods, plant centric, with, obviously good sources of protein as well, but they're missing out on the variety. And this is
Hmm.
really such an important part of it. To be in an optimal state, you want the variety of the different plant food for two reasons. I mean, one is you want the diversity of the phytochemicals. Different ones trigger different types of resistance in our body, so they can serve as antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, anti-cancer agents. They stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis. Their functions are so vast that the greater the diversity of the phytochemicals, the more we are going to enhance our disease resistance. And the second component, which I think is also fairly, very well studied, is the diversity of the fiber
Right.
optimizing our gut microbiome. So even within a healthy diet, we see people that are in a suboptimal healthy state. And so I think of it as healthy eating 2.0.
Yeah, I like that. And for menopausal women especially, I like, and I feel like the message is out there, but maybe it's not as sexy as protein. The fiber thing keeps falling kind of by the wayside, and it's so important because the gut microbiome changes with age and with the hormonal transition, and that
Yes.
helps with your hormonal balance too. It's just really important.
It is. I think it all comes down to always first asking the question, what are your goals from any eating pattern, any exercise routine? And if the goal is a certain performance goal, muscle protein synthesis, the diet recommendations or the exercise recommendations may be different than if the goal is general healthy
Mhm.
aging and disease resistance. So when you're thinking about the long game here, and that's what we're talking about, then you need that variety both in the phytochemicals, just as you do with exercise training. If you just did one muscle group, you're never going to get the same level of optimization in the different muscle fibers, et cetera. So that diversity becomes a really important component for general health. So the goals really have to be defined to answer the question, what is better or best in any situation?
Yeah, and I would argue you need both. You,
Yes, yeah, of
yeah,
course,
yeah.
but I think that's also where um, there's sometimes controversy because there's not clarity on
Mm,
what we're talking about,
yeah.
in terms of what we're trying to achieve.
Let's talk about cold and heat therapy because both are incredibly trendy for the past few years, I would say. And there's great research behind all of it. Sauna continues to fascinate me, and heat shock proteins I think are really interesting. So, what's your finding there as far as we're talking about with this hormesis concept?
Heat and cold are one of the stressors that our ancestors were exposed to, and really throughout most of human history. I mean, we didn't get indoor heat and air conditioning until the
Right.
Industrial Revolution. So our entire DNA is really adapted towards certain stressors, including the heat and cold. And when we're exposed to heat and cold, we trigger these cellular stress responses as our bodies try to reestablish homeostasis, that kind of natural balance. So when our body temperature, our core temperature, either increases from exposure to sauna or decreases from a cold plunge, our enzymes still want to operate most efficiently at a 98.7-degree range. So our bodies have this incredible, redundant mechanisms to reestablish that body temperature, get us back towards that homeostasis because we sense it as a threat. That stress response is felt at the level of our cells. So cold and heat, just like high intensity exercise, just like plant chemicals, trigger these healing mechanisms in our body. And what I haven't really done yet is define what are these cellular stress responses,
Hmm.
because they're activated by cold and heat, just as the other toxins we've talked about. But there are seven of them.
Okay.
They include our antioxidant response, which we've mentioned, an anti inflammatory response where we regulate inflammation, so just the right amount without collateral damage to healthy tissue. We have a DNA repair response, which repairs damage to our DNA, which is happening every day. There are about 10,000 injuries to our DNA in any 24-hour period. It's actually incredible what a healing machine our body actually is. We repair proteins through two cellular stress responses. We have the heat shock proteins, as you mentioned, that get activated by heat, but also by cold and by fasting and by high intensity interval training. There's a lot of synergy between these stressors. We have an unfolded protein response. So proteins have to be folded in just the right shape and balance to function. So if I think of it as, you remember those little fortune tellers we used to fold with paper when
Yes.
we were kids? So proteins have to have this perfect shape. And if you didn't fold those fortune tellers right, like they wouldn't open right and you couldn't read your fortune. And it's the same with our proteins. They need to be folded in a just right manner for them to function properly.
Mm.
And proteins are critical for our cellular functions. If they're the enzymes, they do so many critical roles. If proteins clump, they don't form properly, that increases our risk of chronic diseases like Alzheimer's disease. It impairs our ability to have good metabolic health. So, proteins are a critical part of this cellular function. We have a sirtuin response. Sirtuins help us regulate energy in our body. So the sirtuin response helps us kind of match our energy needs to our ability to kind of rise up to that occasion. One
Are
of
they hormones? What is a sirtuin?
the proteins,
Oh, they're proteins.
yeah,
Okay.
and they are ultimately really converging on our mitochondria. They're
Mm.
trying to help us have the right or an increased amount of mitochondrial density, volume of mitochondria, and the efficiency, how well they function. And we have an autophagy response. Autophagy is our body's natural ability to recycle damaged cells and older cells. It's kind of like the junkyard of sorts in our cells, right? Where we can take damaged cars, clunkers, recycle the parts that are salvageable. What's not salvageable, our body converts to energy. And we do that in the lysosome, which is the part of our cells that do the autophagy. So the autophagy response is our seventh cellular response. So when we encounter the stress of heat and cold, we are doing all of these repair mechanisms because our bodies sense the stress and we start to do this cell resistant or stress resistant state that we go into. And that makes our cells operate more efficiently and it triggers these pathways that help us in the process of reestablishing homeostasis.
Are they, speaking of heat and cold, are they synergistic? Can you do one without the other, or is both best? What do we know?
Yeah, there's yes, so much looking into that question. So there seems to be a benefit to doing both. And in cultural traditions in Scandinavian countries, like Finland, for example, the traditional culture tends to be both. In fact, there's a study by Susanna Soberg where she identified a sweet spot of how much cold and heat in a given week. And the minimum threshold, the sweet spot was 11 minutes of cold and 57 minutes of heat, broken down in 2 to 3 sessions in a week with several cycles within each session. So there seems to be an additive effect. There seems to be a bigger spike in growth hormone when people go from cold to heat and cold to heat and then end on cold. So there does, but there's an independent benefit from each one. So you can really utilize any of these stressors in so many ways and still get a benefit. One of the things that really excites me about these good stressors is that they're part of ordinary life. Like, we're not talking about anything that's extreme. They're very practical. To me, they are a way of living. And if anything, they were the normal way of living until about 200 years ago. And it's become this big cultural shift towards comfort in our lives where reintroducing the stress seems radical, but in reality, that is the normal that our human genome has adapted to. So I'm really trying to encourage people to go back to this normal need for the stress stimulus for us to get to this natural state of health that is hardwired in our body.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And is the little tangential, but maybe not the vagus nerve that the hit that you get when you go into cold specifically that I know people that use cold plunges for mood regulation. That
Yes.
is their number one reason that they do it. I hate cold with the strength of seven suns. I so much hate being cold, but I will do it, and you do feel. I mean, you legitimately feel better. Is that related to what we're talking to, or something a little different?
It's very much related. With all of these stressors, initially there's a stress response, like a spike in cortisol. But after the exposure to the stressor, your basal level, your baseline level of cortisol is lower and there's more
Hmm.
parasympathetic drive.
Hmm.
That happens with cold exposure. It happens with high intensity interval training. It happens really through fasting. It activates parasympathetic nervous system response. So, our goal is again to endure that short term stress with the goal of improving our stress resistance. And part of that is reducing our basal level of stress through a higher parasympathetic tone. And when you look at cold plunge studies, one of the most quoted is a study done back in 2000 where people were exposed to an hour of cold water immersion. I believe it was 57 degrees in the study. And dopamine levels were activated by 250%. Norepinephrine levels went up 530%. That is what makes people feel so good, right? There's this high sense of focus from the spike in the norepinephrine. You get such a sense of reward. You feel energized and motivated to deal
Yeah.
with the day. And there's also an anti inflammatory benefit for people who have more chronic anxiety and depression because it reduces some of the neuroinflammation that is associated with that. So, very exciting to be able again to use a physical stressor to improve our mental state. This is that cross adaptation. And we're so focused on managing the stressor in our life by focusing so much on the stress or on our mental state and this whole beauty of how we can use our body to improve our stress resistance is such a beautiful and untapped area for, I think, a lot of people. We don't talk about it enough. But to me, good stress, hormesis, is this ultimate quintessential mind body prescription.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk, which is a trickier one in this audience, to talk about fasting a bit. That is something that anyone who's been listening these past 5 years knows that we don't typically recommend on the show just because we see women falling into low energy availability and reds, and we like women to go into their training with some fuel on board and nail their workouts. Also recognizing, of course, that fasting has been around for a long time, voluntarily or involuntarily, which I think relates to what you're talking about as far as these ancestral, if you will, mechanisms, right? That we're tapping into. I also wonder if this is a place where, which you also refer to, you want to be a little careful about your layering of and stacking of your stress. So can you speak to that a little bit? I know I saw that I was poking around and it seems like you're a runner yourself. So I'm wondering how you think about that.
Yeah. And it comes down to, again, how hormesis is meant to be a mild to moderate amount of stress, and hence what we mean by fasting. The Through the lens of hormesis, I think the optimal fasting is just time restricted eating, trying to go a little bit more than 12 hours
Hmm.
and then breaking the fast. I think from that lens of hormesis, that's enough to create that metabolic switch from using glucose to using fats. Ketones are a signaling molecule and they tell our cellular stress responses to get activated. So, just enough to get these housekeeping, stress resistant functions activated, create the metabolic flexibility, enhance our mitochondrial function. but not to the point of overwhelm where going beyond that, it's analogous to overtraining, where you're kind of past that point where your body's optimized and you're going to end up with more fatigue than you are with energy. And so within that lens, your question is this great one of how do you manage exercise with that fasted state? As a runner, I can tell you for me, it all depends on the duration and the intensity of my workout. If I'm going for just a few miles in the morning, I'm usually okay being in the fasted state. If I want to do a long run, and for me, I'm probably not nearly as fit as your audience. So for me, a long run is anything past an hour.
Well, no, that's a legit long run.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, for your
Yeah.
audience, that's probably
No,
for just
that is a legit long run.
maybe a warm up for some of you guys, but but for me, I consider that you know the duration at which, at least for me, not having some fuel starts to become counterproductive, because I've pushed past that sweet spot, that Goldilocks of how much stress exposure, right? Because if you again look at the physiology, as I think your audience and you well know, if you are primarily in a state where you're using ketones and you're adding the stressor where your body needs some glucose, especially at high intensities or higher duration, you simply bonk if
Yeah.
you go a very long duration, or if my workout that day is running with intervals to really get to those higher intensities where I need the glycolysis and more glucose to hit those peaks. You're just not physiologically going to be able to have that same level of performance if you're stacking in that way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think what I'm really saying again is normal eating, because there when you lose that circadian rhythm of eating, when you're eating kind of round the clock,
Yeah.
you are damaging your mitochondria, you're damaging your ability to perform well, produce energy efficiently in your cells. So, restoring that by just, again, normal eating, trying to get to at least 12 hours without eating, I think has benefits. But beyond that, I think we have to be really careful on how we stack the stressors. What I think you may find fascinating, because I think this is incredibly fascinating, from any stress exposure from hormesis, there is a limit to how much growth we can get. And that limit is 20 to 90% above control.
Hmm.
So if we push any stressor, say, or stack them where we're fasting longer or adding cold and heat and doing it all in the morning when our cortisol levels are high, we cannot exceed that benefit of 20 to 90%. We're just going to teeter over into a range where that stress can become harmful. The reason being, our bodies need a certain amount of energy and resources to reestablish our homeostatic balance. It's above and beyond that that we do the growth and adaptation to the exercise and to the stress. So, more stress is not more
Yeah.
benefit.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, the key of what you're asking of
Yeah.
how do you create the stacking and the synergy?
Yeah, and one of the things that I find useful in my own personal life with all of these, and we typically recommend for people, especially who are likely training for something, whether it be a long bike ride or a triathlon, is that it makes a bit more sense in my mind to eat earlier in the day and then stop eating in the evening so you have that longer duration before bed because then you sleep better also without a late dinner, and it just sets up a better circadian rhythm cycle than trying to withhold food from yourself for some amount of time in the morning when you need some fuel to do what you're doing.
100%.
Yeah.
And that reinforces our natural circadian biology, as
Yeah.
you just said, because the same food eaten later in the day will mount a higher glucose spike because
Yeah.
we will not be able to mount the same insulin response as our melatonin level rises. So 100%, the ideal is ending eating 2 to 3 hours before bed, getting that 12 hours, then fueling, having a
Yeah.
super good workout.
Yeah. Awesome. So speaking of circadian and cortisol and all of this, cortisol has taken on this whole life of its own, especially in the menopause space, to the point where I feel like it's a counterproductive conversation almost. People are obsessed over it when, as we've been saying, it's a natural part of our existence. You talk about HRV, and I think instead of getting your cortisol levels measured and worrying about those specifically, is HRV a good proxy for how you're managing everything?
I think, HRV is a good proxy, and there, I'm going to even propose a simpler one,
Mm.
um, is just how you feel, like your energy
That's
level.
always a good measurement. Yes.
I mean, I
Yes.
don't even think we need to be super high tech. I mean, the
Yeah.
goal of any workout, any eating pattern is to feel better, right?
Yeah.
And with hormetic stress, you are hopefully setting a higher set point where your energy is improved. And with quote bad stress, I hate to make it so binary, but with bad
Yeah.
stress, you deplete energy, you go down a path of burnout. So, how you feel is really probably the most fundamental way. Heart rate variability, I think, has its merits because you are looking at the recovery piece as well. So, not just the stress piece. If you are, you know, pushing yourself to the point where you are stacking the stress too much or you are not achieving adequate recovery.
Hmm.
So your nutrition isn't there, you're not fueling appropriately, you're not getting enough rest and sleep. In either scenario, you're going to impact your heart rate variability in an adverse way. So I think that's a very useful gauge with the limitation that different wearables are not the most accurate sometimes in measuring heart rate variability. I think they're improving. So take every data point from a wearable with a grain of salt because I think it's a work in progress to get them to that level of accuracy. So always trust your body more than trust the wearable. If you feel good, that's going to matter more than what your heart rate variability is showing. In measuring cortisol levels, I think to your point, there's so much that is misunderstood because cortisol naturally has what we call diurnal variation. It's higher in the morning, lowest in the evening, so it allows us to stay calm, fall asleep. And in the morning, we need that rise to prepare our body to give us the energy availability, to give us the ability to have cognition and exercise. So, cortisol is going to fluctuate throughout the day. The notion of, um, you know, high levels bad, good, you want low levels. Well, you really don't. You want the natural rhythm to be
Yeah.
supported, right? And then that's the key. So um, I think that is one of the misconceptions. And then the other really big misconception is we've created a fear that anything that raises cortisol is harming us or is not good for us. And I think to get to a healthiest state, it is natural to have spikes of cortisol. For example, when we exercise, we are going to get a spike of cortisol if we do a high intensity interval training, simply because cortisol helps us get the energy that we need for the workouts, right? It is breaking down triglycerides into free fatty acids, it's doing gluconeogenesis to create glucose for us to be able to get through the workout. If we blunt that cortisol response, we blunt the muscle adaptations because the cortisol is also recycling some amino acids from damaged proteins. If we don't have the substrate to have the muscle adaptation from that spike in cortisol, we're not getting the benefit out of that workout. So the body does not have a moral code. Like it's not like cortisol is good or it's bad. It's just responding to the situations we put it under, right? Short bursts of stress net us in a better place than where we began. Like we've already mentioned, we have higher parasympathetic tone. our cortisol level after the spike is at a lower place than before we began. We see improvements in blood pressure, and analogously, when we exercise, we also spike heart rate, we spike blood pressure. It doesn't make exercise harmful. And so I think this is key with all the stressors. It's the pattern that we're adapted to. If cortisol is chronically elevated, the cumulative amount can be harmful, but that's chronic stress, not
Right.
what we're talking about here with hormetic stress.
So I think this is a good place as we come up to the top of the hour here to talk about mindset and the psychological stress piece, which I think is really important because you can feel that when you're challenged, it does create a good buzzy feeling in you. You are energetic, but then you don't want to get into overwhelm. And how we think about things also has a directional shift, one way or the other. So can we talk about that a bit and where that fits into this whole picture?
Yeah, and I love this because this is really an area that dovetails with what a lot of my research on stress and resiliency has been on. And I think there are things I'm going to say that are helpful for all of us, and then things that are specific to women going through menopause dealing with the
Excellent.
stress. In terms of for all of us, this pattern of stress, recover, repeat makes our brain stronger just as it makes our muscles stronger and every part of our body stronger. We look at it as stress inoculation, where again, a mild to moderate amount of stress, not overwhelming stress, but we're talking mild to moderate, followed by recovery, helps us build connections between our brain cells. It helps us create new brain cells through neurogenesis. We have different receptors in our brain where at a low amount of cortisol, those receptors, the mineralocorticoid receptors, enhance synaptic plasticity, the connectivity between our brain cells. Whereas at a high amount of cortisol, the cortisol attaches to different receptors in the brain, glucocorticoid receptors that kind of prune those synapses.
Hmm.
So the key here is that you want this mild to moderate amount of challenge, of stress, right? So the competition, the public speaking, whatever it is that creates that stress state. And then you get better at it because following that stress exposure, your brain is rewiring so that you can handle future stress better, right? So we think of stress as a vaccine that way. The second part is the nature of the stress. And to me, this is really what speaks to my heart because if the type of stress aligns with your belief system, it is meaningful, it is purposeful, you do not need to fear that stress. When we have stressors that matter to us, we are triggering a different biochemical profile in our stress response. It is not just fight or flight. We're releasing dopamine, which again helps us with reward. We are releasing oxytocin, and that helps us with the connection that we're making in that stress response. These are stress, these are hormones also released during the stress response that are mitigating cortisol. They are actually helping us. And in study after study, including what we've looked at, if you combine stress plus purpose, you do not see it hurt our aging process. When you look at biological age, it is not impacted if there is purpose, meaning, a sense of mastery involved with that stress exposure. So I really want people to feel that there's permission to be stressed. And we don't have to be stressed over being stressed when it is something that is helping us achieve our greatest good and our greatest human potential. And this matters so much to women going through the menopause transition because it is, we have estrogen receptors in every part of our body. It is just as much a mental transition. So initially, we know through a lot of work done by Dr. Mosconi, Lisa Mosconi,
Hmm.
who has shown that because we are less able to use glucose in our brain, we start to break down white matter. It affects the connectivity in our brain. We have less efficient mitochondria. All those things cause the mood dysregulation. They cause the forgetfulness, the brain fog that can come with the menopause transition. But the brain is adapting to a stronger state in postmenopause where we have better emotional regulation. It's a calmer brain, it is a more empathic brain. We are poised for good stress post menopause. We are poised to pursue things that are meaningful and valuable to us. Our brain is becoming really that super brain that can handle those stressors better. And we do not need to fear them. We can reach our highest level of human capability in this postmenopause state. So the two pieces of the mindset that I hope people walk away with is don't fear stress that helps you achieve what matters to you in life. This is complete permission to undo all of this notion that all stress is harmful. The second part, which if there's nothing that people walk away with other than this, I think, I'll feel great about this conversation, is how your mindset is about stress affects the physiologic response your body has to the stress. If you believe that stress is harmful, you will get more cortisol reactivity. If you believe that stress is beneficial, that you're mounting the stress response because this matters to you, this is your body preparing you to be its best, that mindset alone reduces the stress reactivity in your physiologic response. So I think that is ultimately the goal of the science of good stress, of hormesis. It's we're shifting away from trying to nudge, hammer, control, contain the stressor. And the shift is towards increasing our resilience and anti-fragility to the stress. So using stress to build stress resistance, which is so counterintuitive, and rethinking stress, changing the mindset so that we realize stress can be beneficial, and that alone is already helping our physiology and our adaptation to stress.
Beautifully, beautifully said. And if you were on one of those broadcasts, you could just say, iron sharpens iron, man. Because that's, that's same idea, but much more beautifully said.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I could listen to you talk. You have a wonderful hormesis tone to your voice, and it's very engaging and soothing all at the same time. So I really enjoy talking to you.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, Celine. I have such respect for the work that you do, the community that you serve, which I think, um, you know, needs a space to get the type of information you get. And I think you really fill the void of helping active women because the assumption with aging, with health, with longevity is that we're all just metabolically unhealthy and
Yep.
we're diseased and just doing something is good, but there's so much art and nuance when you have already done the general right things that we all know are good for us, and to provide a space where you can really delve into, well, what exactly is happening to our body and how to really optimize, I think is just such a huge service. So thank you for the incredible work that you do and how well you communicate that both in your writing and on your podcast.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with boxer and physical therapy exercise specialist Jessica Dabrowska to talk about her professional and personal journey through perimenopause and what keeps her in the ring. So come on back for that one. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @Feisty Menopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.